That's it. Right, thanks. Thank you very much for the invite. My job is to tell you a little bit about the global economy. I'll just do it. Okay, thanks. About the global economy and the South African economy and some political developments that's happening. I had the fortunate experience to got stuck in Russia last year, my family and I, and that was quite an experience. And I'll tell you a little bit about that because I firsthand found out what sanctions meant to sit on an airport somewhere without money because your credit cards don't work. So that's something. All right. So the presentation will go on until about 11 o'clock. And then I will take, if that's okay, 15 minutes or so questions if there are any. Happiness with that? Yeah. Okay, sure. All right, let's get going. This presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine, what's going on there, what can be expected. I think that's quite important. Like I've said, we were in Russia recently, married to a Russian girl. We've been married for approximately 18,000 years now. So we were in Russia for a wedding, a family wedding. And I can tell you this intimate relationship, allegedly, between Russians and vodka, that has been confirmed to me a couple of times. So that was really quite enjoying. And if you've never been to Russia, one of the places that you need to go to certainly is Sochi. It's on the Black Sea, a really beautiful place. So I have a bit of a chat about that, what's going on internationally, because all of this is happening in certain contexts. I have a look at the South African economy and a few things, one or two things that we can thank our dear government for. And of course, our president seems to be in some trouble himself recently, having allegedly $4 million in cash, which is illegal, and a couple of final remarks about the South African economy. All right, let's just see where the world was before what happened in what is currently happening in the Ukraine. The world economy has just got out of a lockdown, and what happens if you lock people up for 2 weeks or a month or a year in a flat, and you let them out, then they run out and go and buy stuff. And that's exactly what's happened. So as the world is gradually opening up, the world economy is gradually opening up, everybody was running out to go and buy stuff. So there was this huge increase in demand globally, which was completely and totally expected, of course. Now, because of this increase in demand globally, there's a lot of disruptions in supply chains, as an example. And that, of course, the increase in demand is pushing up prices as well. But that is happening while governments in the world were stimulating the economies like there's no tomorrow. In the case of the United States, they literally started sending checks to their citizens in the US. So apart from opening the economies, governments actually provided cash to their citizens, and all of that added to this huge increase in prices internationally. Before that, that was also happening in the context of exceptionally loose monetary policy. Now, loose monetary policy means two things in the global, when you talk about global monetary policy. It means low interest rates, not only low interest rates, very low interest rates, and in some instances, interest rates below zero, but it also means that central banks started experimenting with all sort of funny things the past 10 years, in fact. Things like, for example, quantitative easing. What quantitative easing means is that central banks are making money out of nothing, and they use this to buy certain financial instruments. So they're replacing cash on the balance sheets of financial instruments on the balance sheets of banks. They're replacing that with cash. So all this cash was available to send to banks, and banks could start lending this out the moment there is demand for credit, which gradually started happening. So all of this huge stimulus from the fiscal side, from the monetary side, as well as an increase opening up of the economies, all of that resulted in this huge increase of inflation that we're currently experiencing globally. And then on top of all of that, the whole thing in the Ukraine happened. So I think the world is really facing quite a difficult time at the moment. From a political point of view, the invasion of Putin in the Ukraine is clearly dividing the world into two. So there are two parts of the world, and this is nothing real, nothing really that new. The world has been divided into two for quite some time. It's only recently, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we thought we've got this one united world with globalization going to force economic growth forever and a day. But clearly what is happening is the world is again divided into political power blocks, if you like. So it seems to me as we're entering a new Cold War kind of era, which is important to understand. And on top of this increasing demand globally, there's a restriction in certain or disruption in certain commodities, like, for example, oil exports. and that is having a further impact on the prices of all sort of things, especially commodity prices. Not only commodity prices, so-called hard commodity prices, but also soft commodity prices, like, for example, food prices. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. So the two leaders, the two power blocks globally are the United States and and of course Europe. But Europe is a junior partner in this. NATO, basically led by the United States, is a senior partner without a doubt. And the second power block in the world today is China. And China is the senior partner and Russia is the junior partner to all of this. Of course, Putin doesn't like that. Putin thinks he's on par with Xi Jinping when it comes to power, but that is certainly not the case. The Chinese economy is the biggest economy in the world already, based on the purchasing power parity approach. And the Chinese economy, I mean, the growth that we've seen in the Chinese economy the past couple of years was absolutely astonishing. We've never seen so much wealth creation the past 20, 30 years coming from the Chinese economy. Just a side note, the Chinese succeeded in uplifting more than 600 million people out of poverty, out of abject poverty, within a matter of about 20 years. We've never seen so much wealth creation in the world that what we saw in China. So the Chinese economy, they do not have the military backing yet, but before you can build up your military forces, you need an economy, and the Chinese certainly do have that. And the two economic power blocks and two military power blocks are basically led by the Americans and the Chinese today. So we have the two worlds, the US dominated and the Chinese dominated. And one can ask the question now, will the US dollar remain? Will the US dollar remain the world's most important reserve currency? And the short answer to that is certainly yes. Maybe I can just step back for a moment and discuss some of the sanctions that have been announced against Russia. And some of these sanctions include cutting Russia off from the so-called SWIFT system. Now, the SWIFT system is basically a payment system with approximately 12,000 financial institutions belonging to that globally. And these institutions, the SWIFT system facilitates the flow of cash internationally. Now, the Russians have approximately $630 billion in reserves, and they have been cut off from the SWIFT system, basically meaning that the Russians do not have access to approximately $400 billion of reserves. And that's part of the reason why the ruble took a bit of a knock just after this specific announcement. The problem with this is that if you use this bullet, you can use it only once. And I think it was a mistake from the Western world to cut Russia off from the SWIFT system, because what will happen now is, and it's already happening, is that the Chinese and the Russians will establish their own alternative payment systems. They've already started doing that, eroding the importance of the US dollar internationally as well. So eventually the US dollar will become less important. And some of the rivals, of course, are the euro and the renminbi themselves, but the dollar will remain the world's dominant currency. And the most important reason for that is simply because the exceptionally liquid and deep capital markets of the US economy. Let me explain what I mean by that. If the South African Reserve Bank, for example, get access to that $4 million of the president, where it's supposed to be, we as individuals, we're not allowed to have cash, which is a stupid and a silly idea. But anyway, that's the law. So those $4 million will eventually end up at Lesetja Kganyago at the South African Reserve Bank. He will not keep those $4 billion in his own couch. No, what he will do, he will use those dollars and reinvest it back in the United States, typically in US Treasury bills. And he will do that because the US Treasury bills are the most traded financial instruments globally. And that's the reason. That is the main reason why the US dollar is the dominant currency in the world, because of this very deep financial markets behind that. You can invest in the US financial markets. It's not that easy to invest in Europe, as an example, because you have to choose, am I going to invest in Bunds, that's the German financial instruments, or I'm going to invest in Greek financial instruments, or Italian, or whatever the case. They don't have a unified capital market in Europe yet. While in the case of the Chinese, if you want to invest in the renminbi and their capital market, you are limited to how much you can invest in China. And for that simple reason, the US dollar is likely to remain the dominant currency in the world for a long time still to come. But eventually, but also the US dollar will falter, because all currencies that have been under the control of governments always come to an end, without exception, if you go through history. In the case of the South African currency, the rand, for example, it's 60 years old, 61 years old this year. And over that 61 years period, the South African currency, the rand, has lost nearly 99% of its value. Nearly 99% of it. It's not a typo, nearly 99% of its value. Okay. I have been to Russia. We just came back from Russia. We went to a town, like I've said, called Sochi. And of course, as an economist, I wanted to find out what people think about the war in Ukraine, because that will determine what's going to happen. That's going to determine who's going to win the war. That will determine whether Putin will hold on to some of the pieces that he's conquered in the Ukraine. And that will determine what's going to happen to commodity prices and the world economy and that sort of stuff. So here are a couple of things that I've picked up and a couple of things that I've learned. We have to remember that the eastern part of the Ukraine is mostly Russian-speaking, ethnic Russian-speaking, while the rest of the Ukraine are mostly Ukrainian-speaking, which is close to Russian, but it is a bit of a difference. The western part of the Ukrainians are also mostly Catholics, while the eastern part are Russian Orthodox, which is also important to understand. I've spoken to many Russians, and there are a couple of questions that one can ask about this war in the Ukraine. Like, for example, do you support Putin? Do you think he's a good guy? Do you think Russia should be in the Ukraine? Do you think Russia should take over part of the Ukraine, like, for example, the Donbas area and the Krim, for example? And you get various different answers to this. What I am very, very sure about is that there is absolutely no way that the Russians will give the Donbas area or the Krim back to the Ukraine. They will keep that. We simply have to make peace with that. Henry Kissinger made a comment that we have to, that's a so-called real politics. We have to accept the fact that the Russians have taken over certain parts of the Ukraine and the Krim area. I know the Western world calls it Crimea, but the Russians call it Krim. And that we simply have to make peace with the reality that the Russians will, from now on, that will be part of Russia. Keep in mind, there's another similar sliver of land between Moldova and the Ukraine called Transnistria, with a similar mix of ethnic and religious sort of groupings that we have currently in the Donbas area. And it's quite possible that Putin may decide to also invade that part, which is actually part of Moldova at the moment. If he does that, he will basically cut off the Ukraine completely from the Black Sea. So that is a very good possibility that eventually may happen. Clearly, what is happening is that the Russians are slowly winning the war, very slowly. They're consolidating their position in the eastern part of the Ukraine, and eventually they will take over completely those two areas that I've mentioned. What is a surprise, and I think was a strategic mistake by Putin, is the resistance offered by the Ukrainians. He did not expect that. And because of this unexpected resistance from the Ukrainians, he even threatened with nuclear war. And that, without a doubt, is also a possible outcome of this thing, that it can eventually escalate into something much bigger, third world kind of thing. But like I've said, it's the history that matters. It's complicated. There's much to this. It's not only a matter of Putin invading an independent country. There's much more to that. For example, in 1989, NATO promised that they will not expand further to the east, which they subsequently did. If you can take it back to 1962, when the Russians put a couple of missiles on Cuba, right at the front door of Washington, and Kennedy nearly started the World War and forced the Russians to remove those missiles from Cuba. Now, NATO is pretty much at the front door of Moscow as well. So is that not similar kind of situation? So it's complicated. I did mention some sanctions were implemented against the Russians. Initially, the Russian dollar tanked. They increased interest rates quite a lot in Russia, but subsequently they started reducing interest rates again, and the ruble also appreciated quite nicely. I can tell you, I was in Russia, like I've said, there's no sign of war whatsoever. I've spoken to people, and they're all quite upbeat and optimistic about the economic future. They are complaining a little bit about inflation, but that's an international phenomenon. I did mention the reserves, and I did mention the Russians, the ruble as well. Interesting thing is, because of these sanctions against Russia, it is difficult and nearly impossible for the Russians to pay off their foreign debt, because the Americans said you're not allowed to pay off your foreign debt, despite the fact that they do have the money available to do that. So what you're doing, you're forcing, well, at least that's what the Americans are trying to do. And I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm trying to be an objective analyst here, but the Americans are trying to force the Russians into a default on their foreign debt, which is quite interesting. So there's a lot of political stuff going on. So here are some of the scenarios that I think the whole thing is going to pan out. I think the most likely scenario is that the whole thing is going to end in a stalemate kind of situation, where the eastern part of the Ukraine will be taken over by the Russians, including Crimea. It's possible it can expand further to Transnistria, but I predict, and that's the most likely scenario, that we're going to see a protracted, very low-level civil war kind of thing for many, many years to come, which will have certain implications for commodity prices and the like. I'll get to that now. But it is also possible that there can be some sort of accident. During wars, accidents do happen. The Americans, for example, and the Europeans are providing the Ukrainians with long-range missiles now, and a trigger-happy Ukrainian may decide to shoot a missile to Moscow as an example. And that can trigger a real global war, including a global nuclear war. Before we get too worried about Nagasaki and Hiroshima kind of nuclear explosions, that certainly is a possibility, but a nuclear war is likely to take the form of a tactical nuclear exchange, which are relatively small nuclear weapons, but still nuclear weapons. A third possibility is certainly that Putin could be ousted. That is certainly possible. I don't think that is going to be that easy to do for various reasons. And I can also tell you that Putin is not sick. I don't think he's sick like the Western media is reporting. And I also think he's not mad. There is a context to all of this. I think it's also important to understand that what is happening to China. I was initially quite concerned when this war started that China may use this as an opportunity to seize Taiwan. I'm not too concerned about that yet. And the reason why I say so is because the total reserves of the Chinese on the SWIFT system is more than $3 trillion. So the Russians know what's happening to the Chinese know what's happening to the Russian economy, and I don't think they will yet seize Taiwan, because if the Chinese are also sanctions from SWIFT, then that will have an impact on the economy as well. I think they would rather first establish an alternative payment system before they invade China, but that certainly is a possibility. And like I've said, also from now on, Russia is going to be the junior partner in this coalition between Russia and China. Maybe another side note, what people are not aware of, there are many territorial disputes still going back 100 to 200 years between China and Russia. And maybe I can remind you of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement just before the Second World War, where Germany promised not to invade Russia, and in fact that's exactly what they've done soon after the start of the Second World War. So there are no necessarily friends in any war. So keep in mind there are some territorial disputes between the Chinese and the Russians as well, and the Chinese without a doubt are eyeing some of these commodities of the Russians. India is another wild card that we have to keep an eye on. India is officially currently neutral on the specific stance. I think the Indians are likely to remain neutral, and eventually they will drift more towards the West in this. But in the moment, the Indians are neutral. And maybe another comment about the Indians. Of all the big economies in the world, I think the Indian economy is that one that's going to take the place in terms of world economic growth of the Chinese over the next couple of decades. So the new big favorite in the world is going to be India. If you want to do international business, up to now, China was the place to be. I think from now onwards, India is going to be the place to be. There are some political issues there, but I think India certainly is the place to be. All right, so that's a scenario. That's the international scenario. In the meantime, what we have seen, central banks have started increasing interest rates globally. They've started reducing quantitative easing, and soon we're going to talk about quantitative tightening, where central banks are withdrawing liquidity globally. And the reason for that is because of very high levels of inflation, of course. Given my expected scenario in Ukraine, I think that we're going to see commodity prices on the high side. But I think in maybe a year and a half, 2 years time or so, especially oil prices are likely to slowly start drifting lower. The reason is simply because there are many alternative sources of energy that can be exploited, but it takes some time for that to get online. What I am very concerned about is the coming famine. And again, economists don't make predictions. They don't like to make predictions because they're usually wrong. But I am very concerned about the food prices, which have gone up quite sharply internationally, especially for South Africa. I'll get back to that a little bit later. And we will see that we've already seen that input costs like fertilizer costs has gone up. So it's very expensive to invest in agriculture. Your input cost is quite expensive. There are disruptions coming from the Black Sea because the Ukraine is a major producer of grains. Also, Russia and also other places like, for example, China and India, and some of them like the Indians stopped the export of all grains already. So prices are going up and yields are falling. So I have a suspicion that we're going to talk about famine globally. Countries like, for example, certain places as usual around the Sahel, Somalia, for instance, Chad already announced a famine in Chad. So Chad is officially receiving international assistance as far as food is concerned, and other countries like Sri Lanka, for example, also countries that can potentially, in fact, they already experiencing some serious economic issues in those countries. And of course, South Africa as well, but I'll get back to that a little bit later. So on commodities, it's not only bad news for South Africa. South Africa is a major exporter of certain commodities, like, for example, platinum, certain hard commodities, platinum, palladium, and stuff like that. And on a net basis, South Africa is actually winning because of the spike in commodity prices. We're currently running a nice current account surplus, which is supporting, amongst others, our currency. But the downside to commodities is, of course, it's adding upward pressure to inflation, which is especially bad for poor people. So it's good and well for grain prices to go up if you're a grain producer in South Africa, but it's not a good idea. It's not a good thing if grain prices go up if you're a poor South African, and we have plenty of those. Some specific opportunities for South Africa that I have identified. In a weird kind of way, South Africa is not a very safe place to be, but all of a sudden, South Africa is seen, at least partly, as a kind of a safe haven. And some places that I think there are really opportunities for South Africa is, amongst others, in agriculture. And I think this is an opportunity for South Africa to expand into the rest of Africa. Really, this is an opportunity. And also in mining, we're already getting much of that. Unfortunately, we have a highly destructive government, making it very difficult to invest in certain industries. Mining is a very good example. And of course, the financial markets is also a weird kind of place, which can be seen as a safe investment destination for the world. I've spoken to many Europeans, and the Europeans are very concerned about what's going on in the eastern part of Europe. Okay, a couple of numbers about the South African economy. Let me just run through some numbers on the South African economy. I have a graph here. This is part of the economy. It's one of that set of data that I do a lot of research on. It is government finance, state finance. The red line is simply state spending, how much the state is spending in South Africa. You'll see why I get to this just now. And the bottom line, the blue line, is state revenue, how much money the state is collecting out of the economy. This is quite relevant at the moment because we're talking about the fuel levy in South Africa, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. So the red line is how much they're spending as a percentage of GDP, and the blue line is how much money they're getting out of the economy away with the various taxes. So the gap between the two is referred to as a so-called fiscal deficit. That's the amount of money that the state needs to go and borrow. Unfortunately, for many years now, the state spending has been going up as you can see, quite clearly see, and they've been borrowing like huge amounts of money. And the result of all this borrowing is that we have state debt levels today that has become just about totally unsustainable. So state, maybe let me just run back for a moment to this one again. I just want to make a comment about the commodity cycle. So commodity prices are nice and high. We're exporting a lot of platinum and stuff like that. They're making a lot of money, the platinum mines, and they pay a lot of taxes. So the short-term benefit of the high commodity prices is also that the revenue for the Minister of Finance is doing a little bit better than previously expected. But nevertheless, state spending has gotten completely out of hand, and in the process, state debt levels have increased to levels that we've never ever seen before. Currently, state debt as a percentage of GDP is standing at approximately 70% of GDP, excluding the big I call them parasitals, like Eskom, for example, and so on. You have to add another 10% to that as well. So we have state debt, and that's important because that debt is guaranteed by the national government. So the total outstanding debt of the South African state today is in excess of 80% already. Now, this number, as you can clearly see, from 2010, roughly, it was standing at about 30%, and it's currently standing at about 70%. So it's more than a doubling in a matter of only a few years. A huge, a massive, and this is unsustainable. We simply cannot keep on doing this. Remember, many other countries in the world, they have debt to GDP ratios much higher than that. In the case of South Africa, the difference is when we pay 10% if we want to borrow money on 10-year money in South Africa, the Americans pay 2%. That's the big difference. So it's not only how much you owe, but it's also what is the interest that you pay in the debt. I did mention that we're exporting very nicely in South Africa at the moment because of the current account, because of the commodity cycle. So that's quite good and well. I'm going to get back to this. So it's supporting, amongst other, the exchange rate of the currency, leading to more of an inflow of money into South Africa. But as soon as the commodity cycle starts slowing down, and there are signs that the commodity cycle is gradually slowing down, it will result in a current account surplus getting smaller and smaller and eventually dipping into a deficit, because it's usually a deficit. And if it dips into a deficit, then I'm afraid we could see things happening like, for example, the currency taking a bit of a knock. But I think we have some time for that. This is something that I'm also concerned about. The state in South Africa is a major destroyer of capital. But I've calculated this. It's all good and well if you borrow long-term money to invest in long-term assets. Like, for example, and I always tell my students, it's good and well to go and borrow money to build a new room for the new baby. That's okay. But if you go and borrow money to go to Mauritius to make the baby, that's not good. That's the difference. And this is what we're doing in South Africa. We're borrowing long-term money to spend on short-term current expenditure, like, for example, salaries and so on. And the result of that is that the state is destroying, say, about 4% of relative to GDP of capital in the South African economy. So we don't save enough. And the little bit that we are saving, part of that is destroyed by this saving by the state, leaving something like 10, 12% or so relative to GDP left over for the private sector to invest in productive assets in the South African economy. This is a major obstacle to economic growth that we don't, to start off with, we don't save enough, but the state is destroying part of this existing capital or savings that are available. Now, this is probably, well, it is, I have no doubt, South Africa's most important social problem, and that is massive levels of unemployment. If you look at the unemployment levels for the youth, depending on your definition for the youth, but unemployment for the youth is between 60 and 80%. This is a time bomb. And the main reason for this is simply because the economy, that's the most important reason. The economy is just not growing. There are many additional reasons to that. This is the narrow definition for unemployment. The broader definition, narrow definition, approximately 35%. The broader definition, if you include people that are not actively looking for jobs, then the unemployment levels in South Africa at 45%. This is likely to remain, and I'll get back to this a little bit later again. South Africa's economic growth, the most recent numbers we got for the first quarter this morning at 1.9%, slightly better than expected. So economic growth, it seems to me that there's a limit to how fast the economy can grow, and part of that reason is simply because we do not have sufficient electricity. You cannot grow without electricity. Keeping a lid on economic growth, it seems to me economic growth is limited to approximately 2% on average. And so we probably, of course, you get 1 year, there's a lot of noise because of the lockdown and all that, but on average, economic growth in the region of about 2% or less can be expected in South Africa, mostly because of electricity. Keep in mind that the population is growing at the rate of approximately 1.5%. So it's very clear that on a per capita basis that we are not making much progress. In fact, for the past more than 10 years, we haven't had much progress in that. So I just want to show you this. Where is the Minister of Finance getting most of his money from? The big one, there he gets nearly 40%. He gets his money from personal income taxes, the most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance. The one at the bottom here, that's value-added taxes. It's close to 30%. And then the gray one over there at 17% is corporate income taxes or company income taxes. And then there's a little blue one over there, up there. That is the fuel levy. That is the fourth most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance. Maybe just a comment about the fuel levy. Currently, we're getting a bit of a respite on the fuel levy. The Minister of Finance reduced the fuel levy by R1.50. And just by the way, the fuel price is going to go up by more than R2 next month again, in any event, because of the high oil price. But so the Minister of Finance decided to extend the fuel levy reduction for another 2 months, R1.50 in this month and another 75 cents for next month. I am against that. All taxes are always bad, but the fuel levy is less bad than other taxes. Like, for example, the corporate tax, company taxes. Company taxes are far worse to the economy than things like, for example, the fuel levy. The fuel levy, there are certain benefits to the fuel levy. It's a broad-based tax. It's an indirect tax. It's relatively easy to collect. It's difficult to evade and stuff like that. While the company tax is very bad for investments. People don't invest because we have to hire company taxes. And anyway, companies shift their complete total tax burden down to you anyway. Companies don't pay taxes anyway. So I'm against this reduction in the fuel levy. In fact, I would actually increase that. What I am also concerned about, and this is another change that the Minister of Finance announced in the budget in February, if you have assets, and that's probably all of you, in excess of 50 million rand, you have from now on, when you fill in your tax form, you have to also declare all your assets at market price. Now, the reason why I'm concerned about that, there has been talk about the so-called wealth tax in South Africa for a number of years now, and maybe this could be the beginning of that. So I don't want to tell the taxman how much money I owe, because if he knows, then he wants some of that. So, and I'm concerned about the possibility of the future wealth tax in South Africa. Let me show you this one. This is an interesting one. On the left-hand side, that is how many people are registered as taxpayers in South Africa. There are approximately 15 million people registered as taxpayers in South Africa. Only half of them pay personal. This is personal income taxes. Only half of them pay personal income taxes because the other 7 million fall below that threshold, that minimum threshold. So of the remaining, say, roughly 7 million people or so, 133,000, that's on the right-hand side, 133,000 individuals pay nearly a third of total personal income taxes. This is massively so-called progressive, which is the wrong word, but that's a word that they use. So very, very few individuals pay a huge chunk of personal income taxes, which is by far the most important revenue source to the Minister of Finance. This is even worse. This is company taxes. There are less than 1,000 companies in South Africa that pay 2/3 of all company taxes. Again, very, very few taxpayers pay by far most of them. One can actually say the companies don't pay taxes in South Africa. 1,000 of them pay taxes and nobody else. And actually, we want far more companies that contribute to the fiscus in South Africa, but they won't do that because our tax levels are far too high, much higher than anywhere else in the world. That's the reason why I say we need to reduce company taxes, amongst others. So the tax base in South Africa is exceptionally narrow, and the people getting benefits from that, there are a huge number of people getting on the receiving side, and I'll show you some of those numbers just now. All right, so this is where the money goes to, the bulk of your money. The biggest expense item for the Minister of Finance is that blue one up there. Total, that's on education, is the biggest expense item. We spend more on education than most countries in the world. The quality of our education is not bad. It is of the worst in the world, and sometimes we are stone last compared to other countries in the world. We sometimes even lower than the quality of education of Yemen, which is at the bottom of the rug, or Morocco, which is also at the bottom mostly. And yet, the Morocco just surpassed South Africa as the biggest motor vehicle exporter on the African continent. Can you believe that? But anyway, so we spend a lot of money on education. That's the biggest expense item. The second most important expense item is this orange one there. I'm going to analyze that a little bit. And that is on a very social expense item, the grants mostly. And then the third most important one, the one that's growing the fastest at the moment, is interest on state debt. And that's the gray one at the bottom. Let me show you this graph. This is the number of people that receive grants in South Africa. The red line, before the lockdown, we had 20 million, roughly 20 million people receiving a grant from the state every month before the lockdown. Subsequently, when the lockdown happened, the government decided to extend that to 10 more million people temporary on the COVID grant, which is only 350 Rand per month. So that means we have today in South Africa 30 million people receiving a grant from the state every month out of the population and less than 65 million. And we have, and what happened in jobs in South Africa the past 2 years? The past 2 years, we lost 2 million jobs. That's the blue line, by the way. We lost 2 million jobs because of the lockdown, and all those jobs were lost in the private sector. Not one single job was lost in the civil servants lost their job, and not one single civil servant took a knock on the pay, for example. So there are 2 million civil servants. So on top of that 30 million people receiving a grant from the state, you can actually add another 2 million civil servants. So we have 32 million people receiving an income from the state every month, and we have 14 million people working in the private sector. It's just unsustainable. It just cannot go on like this. Because of the high levels of state debt, this will come down, and the state will spend less on 32 million people over the next couple of years, in at least in relative terms, because currently the civil servants are demanding another 10% increase. They can't get that. They're going to get less than the inflation rate, which means a reduction in the real value of their salaries. And if you have a lot of people getting money from the state and you're paying them less, they get angry. That's my concern, but I'll get back to that just now. All right, so we have a government in South Africa that is divided within itself. There's a lot of infighting in the ANC. We know what's going on right at the moment. Fraser laying charges against the president as an example. Fraser is obviously part of the so-called RET faction, while the Ramaphosa is part of the Ramaphosa faction. So there's a lot of infighting. We know that. We know also that we have a government that's caused immense damage to the South African economy at various levels. The local authorities are mismanaged. 2/3 of the local authorities are financially simply cannot survive. The state-owned enterprises have been run into the ground financially and operationally. The national departments are a mess. Education is only one example. So expect a continuation of this. Expect a continuation of mismanagement, corruption, and incompetence. I'll just go and have a look at the Zondo Commission, for example, what the Judge Zondo said as an example. So we have some serious issues, and the economic issues in South Africa is mostly because of an incompetent, destructive government called the ANC government. What I'm also concerned about the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Finance is not a bad guy. I think he's the best that they can offer. Unfortunately, even him has got a bit of a skeleton in the closet. And of course, if you mistreat your country, and if you mistreat the people in your country, this is what kind of happens to you. This is just a calculation that I've done. I've used World Bank data on this. I've calculated South Africa's per capita GDP as a percentage of the rest of the world, just to see how we're doing relative to the rest of the world. And in 25 years ago, our per capita GDP, this is a moving average, by the way, but our per capita GDP was approximately 85% to that of the rest of the world. And today it's below 65% to that of the rest of the world, a relative fall of 20 basis points. And we're on our way down further. So South Africans are getting poorer compared to anything, even Sub-Saharan Africa. We are still about 2.5 times as wealthy as the average Sub-Saharan African, but it used to be 3 times as wealthy 25 years ago. So even Sub-Saharan Africa is catching up with South Africa. And something else, electricity generation, again, this is a moving average. 25 years ago, on average, South Africans produced or generated more electricity than the world average. Today, as you can see, it's below 65%, and a very important reason why the economy is not growing. And it's because of state capture, cadre deployment, and all that nonsense. This is perhaps the single most important graph that you will see today. Everything works to one thing. If you want to analyze an economy, all you have to ask for is one set of data, and that's life expectancy. Life expectancy correlates with everything that's good. Good quality health services, education, safe environment, everything correlates with life expectancy. Life expectancy tells you everything about how the economy is doing. South Africa's life expectancy was approximately close to 100% to that of the world 25 years ago. Today it's standing at roughly at about 85% to that of the rest of the world. You can see the huge drop on life expectancy during the silly years of Mbeki and his AIDS policies. That has been turned around. That's probably the only good thing that Zuma ever did. which wasn't really Zuma, it was the treatment action campaign, but anyway, you didn't stand in the way. And the change in policy to AIDS, that's changed, and of course, life expectancy increased quite nicely, but it's still not where it was 25 years ago. And South Africa's life expectancy today is even lower than that of Sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region in the world. Corruption, and if you mistreat people like this, they also don't trust you anymore. So I've got some indices or some graphs showing you what the perceptions are of us, South Africans, to the South African government. This is our perception regarding corruption in South Africa. You can see what's been happening. We think we are a corrupt country, rightfully so. This is the effectiveness of government. Do you think South Africa is an effective government, efficient government? I was in Russia, and part of the reason why we couldn't leave was because we needed passports for the kids. It's a bit of a technical thing. And there were a couple of public holidays. We couldn't apply for the passports, but eventually when we could apply for the passports, from the moment that we filled in those forms until the moment we had the passports in our hands, 4 hours, 4 hours. That's efficiency. Imagine if that the South African domestic affairs had to complete and get our passports, we still would have been in Russia. Political stability, this is something that we need to be concerned of. South Africa was quite unstable 25 years ago. We killed each other quite a lot. As the economy expanded and started growing and things improved in South Africa economically, political stability improved as well. Recently, political stability started deteriorating again, and this does not include what happened last year in KZN and Gauteng. A couple of other things. So we've got some serious issues in South Africa that we need to be concerned about, but there's one exception, very important exception, and that is the South African Reserve Bank. That big black building under control of Lesetja Kganyago is doing an excellent job. Lesetja Kganyago is a conservative central banker. He's doing an excellent job. He's been increasing interest rates recently. He will continue to do that, and that is the right decision. So I hope we all support him in his endeavor trying to get inflation down. Inflation is a bad thing, and the only instrument available to the Reserve Bank is to increase interest rates. There are other things that we can do as well, but those things are not under control of the Reserve Bank. They have the responsibility to get inflation down, and you can only do that with increasing interest rates. But I am concerned about inflationary pressures internationally, but in South Africa as well. And I think we can talk about inflation around about 8% by the end of this year. And if you analyze the inflation part, you will see it's energy prices going up quite a lot and food prices. And that's my big concern. The balance of payments, I made a comment about that. The exchange rate, I will show you some stuff now. And the other numbers I've had a look at already. So this is a toxic mix that we have in South Africa, exceptionally high levels of unemployment. We have rising levels of poverty. Do you know that more than 2,000 kids died last year because of malnutrition, of hunger? 2,000 people, children died in South Africa. We have a lot of political infighting, a lot of political instability, falling income because of weak economy, but also because the state finances are simply stretched to a point where the state must start spending less, and the only place where they can spend less on is less on people. And now we have rising food prices. So I am really concerned about this mixture of all sorts of things in the economy. I don't want to be a bearer of bad news, but we have to be aware is that when people are poor, when people are unemployed, and when food is getting more expensive, people get angry. Be aware of that. We've seen governments fall because of this. I'm not making predictions. I'm just telling you that the environment is a toxic environment. This is just a fun sort of thing. The weird thing is about the South African government. We have a government that is a socialist kind of government with the Communist Party and all that. And the really bad thing, the real irony is that this socialist government that wants to get involved in everything in the South African economy is the government that's privatized more than even Margaret Thatcher could ever hope to do. For example, 25 years ago, South African Airways flew just about all the domestic routes in South Africa, many international routes. Today, they're not even flying because it's been destroyed by the ANC government. And so basically, the airways in South Africa has been privatized. The only difference is the state didn't get any money for that. The same goes for all sorts of other things. Same goes, for example, South African Post Office. The Post Office, by the way, announced that they will stop delivering letters to Russia and the Ukraine. I thought that was really funny. So, but Post Office in South Africa, postal services have been privatized because the private sector has taken over this because the state has simply destroyed the post office. And I mean, even police, there are 3 times as many police, private sector security people in South Africa than police members. We've basically privatized it. My job is, I'm an economist in the financial markets. I take people's money and I invest it. And the financial markets are really quite volatile now because of rising interest rates internationally and uncertainty on commodity prices and conflicts in Central Europe and so on. So the markets are quite uncertain and quite volatile. The big question is, will we dip into a recession globally? I don't think so, but certainly the world economy is slowing down in terms of economic growth. And I do believe that commodity prices, especially oil prices, likely to fall. But for now, we are in quite choppy waters when you talk about the global financial markets. Maybe slightly back, 1 or 2 other comments I want to make, and then we'll be done more or less. There are some very important developments happening that we have to be aware of. And standing back a little bit, the world is actually in the most amazing place. We've never had it this good. There are some short-term hiccups, and we are currently experiencing some short-term hiccups in terms of the world economy and the world financial markets and the war here and there. But if you stand back a little bit, you will realize that we've never had so few wars ever in mankind. Life expectancy globally is the highest it's ever been. Everything is really moving in the right direction, but it's not like a straight line. There are a couple of other things that's also happening that we need to be aware of, and I think in your industry as well, is that if you look at the way that economies evolve over time, they start off in the primary industries, the things like agriculture and mining and so on, and gradually from there, economies move into your secondary industries, where China is typically now, and that's where the manufacturing side is, and then where your mature economy move into the tertiary industries, the service industries. And that's where the Americans and Europeans and the Japanese, the rich countries in the world are. So the world economy is becoming more service-orientated and more digitizable, if you like. That's where the technological part is taking place. And the really nice part is that typical businesses that used to find themselves in the primary industries, like agriculture, for example, large chunk of the value add is actually happening in the service industry, in the tertiary industry. And where we are today is an example of that, because genetic engineering, which is part of agriculture, which is part of the primary industry, is actually happening at universities and labs. That's an example of that. These drones that they're flying around for precision farming and checking all that, that is actually a service that is provided in the service industry. And that is what's happening, is that we have to be aware of this, is that's not the land that matters, less so, much less so. What really matters today is what you do with the land. And that is, so agriculture, where your industry is actually part of the service industry. And it doesn't make much sense to distinguish between these various sectors in the economy. Other things like artificial intelligence making a huge change, and a very good example of other things that are changing, how retail is changing. We're all experts nowadays on how to buy stuff internationally, Googling, we know that, Zooming, we can all Zoom, and we can all do that sort of stuff. Something that were words that most of us didn't even hear about 2 years ago. So the world is becoming more digitized, and we have to be aware of that. 1 or 2 other things is that there's something called the blockchain, and you've heard of Bitcoin. I'm not going to say much about Bitcoin, but what I do want to tell you, there's a revolution coming as far as finance is concerned. Central banks are starting to issue their own central bank digital currencies. If there are any questions about that, I will gladly try to answer those. And that will have a huge impact on the way that we're doing banking. I believe that banks, at least the way that we understand banks, is going to disappear in future. It's going to look completely and totally different. My advice to people is go and buy 100 Rand worth of Bitcoin and play with it so you can get used to the technology. That's the valuable part, not the Bitcoin, the technology. Be very, very careful with your personal information. 4 industries that I do like. I like finance. I think finance is going through huge changes now. That's the industry I really like. Education is going to go through huge changes. The lockdown actually forced us through some of that. Personalized medicine, this watch that I'm wearing can tell me I'm going to get sick before I realize I'm going to get sick, because it's measuring all sort of stuff. That is a huge future growth area that I believe in. And agriculture. Agriculture, we're going to see dramatic changes in agriculture over time. 1 or 2 final remarks. There are many issues in South Africa, many things that we need to be concerned about, but because of the nature of economies, it doesn't matter where you live today. What happens, whether you have the skills, which is the most important part, you have to have the hardware, computer, and you have to have a proper connection. And then it doesn't matter where you are. I was sitting in Moscow, and what happened is that the kids couldn't go to school, and the teacher sent me all the homework and stuff. And I was actually a grade 3 teacher in Moscow, and I was attending to all my meetings and all that because I had a proper connection. So it doesn't matter where you are in many instances. But what we need in South Africa is that we need political leadership, and that's the biggest deficit that we have in South Africa. I will give you some advice on how to allocate your assets in the portfolios if you want to, but there are a couple of things that are important. Keep in mind there's a possibility of a wealth tax coming, which means that you have to make sure that you have to a significant part of your personal portfolio needs to be invested internationally. Apart from the challenges in South Africa, there are simply more opportunities internationally as well. Maybe some advice on how to structure your own personal business as well. Put the ownership of your business in one company and the operations in another company, as an example. Those are the kind of stuff that you need to do. Get good advice on how to do that. And the last one is just this one that I want to show you on the currency, the rand. I've done some calculations on the rand, and there's a certain way that we calculate that. Currently, the rand is trading at about 15 or just over 15 or so to the US dollar. And that is more or less in where it's supposed to be based on the specific technique that we've calculated, that we use to determine the correct value of the currency. If the rand is trading at 18 rand, for example, chances are the rand's going to come back. And if the rand is trading at 12 rand, chances are the rand's going to get weaker. So we update the specific gauge all the time. And currently, where the rand is trading is more or less in the middle of the range where it's supposed to be trading. All right, thank you very much. That is my talk about the South African economy and the global economy and so on. If there are any questions, I will try to answer those. Thank you for listening.
While the screen's getting set up, I might just, I was going to say thank you to Roy, but thank you to the Sawmilling South Africa as well. We've had an amazing few days, getting, I think, hopefully a good cross-section of the industry. And I think clearly Richard is the technical guy from our side. I think I've learned in the last few days that people like me in this industry might be locally referred to as shiny bottoms. For occupying a desk rather than doing real work. But look, it's very nice to be here. We've got a series of slides. We're going to step through an overview of. There we go. So a brief introduction to who we are, Staxa and Westpine. We're going to give, Richard's going to give you an overview of the sawmilling industry in Australia and some of the testing that we've done on products sampled from mills here in South Africa. And then we're going to step through some thoughts on where we see some of the opportunity in the Australian market for the South African product. So look, I think Roy led into this briefly before, but Westpine is jointly owned by two very large Australian listed companies. So one of them is Wesfarmers, the other Fletcher Building. And within the Wesfarmers portfolio, there's the national hardware group Bunnings. So we're in a position where we've got a very closely aligned customer able to provide very large distribution for Swarm and other engineered products in Australia. What the Staxa element of this is a strategic choice by Westpine to say, and we'll step into this a bit more in the slides, is that Australia is constrained in terms of resource availability, and at the moment imports about 20% of its products requirements. And for a business like Westpine, who is resource constrained, the opportunity for us to play into that is to be distributing other manufacturers' products, so playing into the import space. So Staxa is the distribution arm of Westpine, but it will also distribute other manufacturers' products. So just to give you a bit of a sense for where we play, Westpine is we see the number one. We have essentially around 50%, sometimes more, share of the market in Western Australia. But from the statistics you can see up there about the construction in other markets, we have a very small share of what are probably the largest markets in Australia, being New South Wales and Victoria. So not only does Staxa have an opportunity to share in the import flows generally, but it also has the ability to start to generate some share of what are the two or three largest markets in Australia. So with that, that's a brief lead into who we are. I'll hand over to Richard, who's going to start giving you all technical.
Great, thanks. Look, thanks Toby, and thanks Roy, and very big thank you to all of you, Sawmilling South Africa, and particularly to some of your members that we've visited and been hosted by. The hospitality is second to none. It's been fantastic, a great trip, and a rather glorious wrap up to start with. I just hope I can live up to that. Interestingly, I'm a boy from Bloemfontein, and I can do up my shoes. I do wear them mostly. I wanted to give you a quick introduction or quick overview of the industry in Australia. We've obviously got very different socioeconomic factors that drive or have driven the development of the industry to what it is today. And so I'll just give you a really quick summary of where we are. We're in the dark. Sorry about that. Yep, sorry. Technically incompetent, you can see that. The Australian forest estate, we obviously have very large plantations of both hardwood and softwood. Left-hand graph there shows you an illustration of the total area in hectares of hardwood and softwood plantations in the country. We've got, in addition, very large areas of native forest, most of which are now fairly well tied up in conservation reserves and are really unavailable to the industry, except in the form of virtually cottage industry, very, very small sawmills. I'm a part of the softwood sawmilling industry, obviously, and the left-hand graph shows the area there at around about 1 million hectares. It's been that way for quite some time, the last 20 years, and of course, given that, no expansion, it's really saying that our capacity is capped at its current level, roughly, for some time to come. We operate on a 30-year rotation, typically, first thinning at 10 years, second thinning at 20, final harvest at 30 years, for an annual softwood sawlog production of around about 15 million cubic metres of log. Only about 11 of which, 10 to 11 million cubic metres a year, is processed domestically, and the balance exported. It's relatively small log, and is essentially second thinnings, and the top log out of the final harvest. Typically in final harvest we'll get 3 logs, butt log, second log, which are the primary source of our sawn timber, and the third log is, you know, not favoured but processed by some people, especially West Pine. The industry is spread around Australia, and you can see in the far bottom left-hand corner, that's us, West Pine. The red spots on the map, and they're rather hard to see, but the red spots are indeed the softwood plantation areas, okay? The rest of the country, you can see, has numerous sawmills. Indeed, I've only shown the locations of the 13 largest mills. Okay, those 13 largest mills comprise 86% of the total sawn production in Australia. The graph on the right there, the blue line is a plot of the log intake to the sawmills, which are ranked in order from left to right, highest or largest sawmill to the smallest. And you can see then the cumulative log intake, which is the orange curve, that's on the right-hand side, on the right-hand axis. That shows you how the 13 largest mills comprise 86% of our production. The average size mill is 480,000, which is around about West Pine size. So the mill that we come from is round about an average large sawmill in Australia. The balance of those are shown on the map there on the right-hand side, clustered in the southeastern corner of the mill, of the country, sorry. A typical sawmill. The typical sawmills in Australia are highly automated, very highly automated. We make extensive use of log scanning, cutting optimization, and automated control. Most typically, we debark offline. We pass our logs through chipper canter, gang saw, or chipper canter quad saw, I'm sorry, mainly band saws. There are 3 significant large sawmills which use circular, quad circular saws as their primary breakdown. We use circular gangs for our cants, board edges, typically 3 or 4 saw, optimized trimmers, bin sorters. So we use automated sorting, somewhere between 50 and 80 bins is common. And the mills run at a rate of somewhere between 120 and 150 cubic metres an hour, typically. That's logging. Recovery rates, nominal size basis, are somewhere between 58 and 61%, typically. And you can see there on the right-hand side, outfeed of a typical quad band primary breakdown saw. Drying, we generally speaking dry at temperatures between 120 and 140 degrees C. That'll get you 50 millimetre nominal thickness dry in around about 12 hours, 38 millimetre in 9 to 10, something like that. We use mainly batch kilns to do that, 70 or 80 cubic metres capacity, but there are a few continuous kilns making their way into the industry now. From a dry mill perspective, again, highly automated. We use automated grading and automated sorting, very similar to the sawmill. Automated grading would use a combination of technology, generally speaking. In our case, we use a MetraGuard and an LHG. An LHG is a scanning system. You can see there illustrated at the bottom right, laser scanning, vision scanning, numerous different forms of scanning. We combine that information with the local stiffness as measured by a MetraGuard to give us predictions of strength and stiffness for our grading. We also have very sophisticated QC sampling and testing in most mills. Our standards drive us that way, and I'll talk about that a little bit more down the track. In the case of West Pine, we've got a system that enables us to steer both strength and stiffness in real time. So in order to produce material that's compliant to the grades or grading standards, we have this system that enables us to react to changing resource. In the case of West Pine, interesting to note that we're the only significant sawmill in Western Australia, and as such, we draw material from as close as 20 kilometres from the mill to as far as 300 kilometres. It's highly variable in quality, and we have to be able to react and respond in order to accommodate that. The typical sort of labour structure at a mill, you can see there the numbers are summarised in the little table on the left-hand side, showing you typical numbers of people employed in the mills. total of around about the 180 to 200 is fairly common for our size of mill. Just to get the context here, our process workers on a South African rand equivalent, we're paying something like 50,000 rand a month. Trades, quite a lot more expensive at somewhere around that 100,000 rand equivalent a month. So you can see our labour costs are massively higher, and that's the primary driver for the automation and you know, the drive for high-tech equipment. On the right-hand side, you can see the typical breakdown of the cost of our final dry machined graded structural product. You can see there that half the cost of the finished product is made up of fibre cost or log cost, and 25% of labour. So probably quite a different structure from that to which you are accustomed. We're currently experiencing upward pressure on wages and on general operating costs, and we've heard a bit about inflation in South Africa this morning. The same applies in Australia. We're in a high inflation environment at the present time, and you can see there it's going to have an impact on us should we see significant wage cost breakouts. The product from the sawmill, illustrated here in the graph, the predominant product is the green on that graph there. That's structural. That's our MGP grades typically, and you can see there that there are nonetheless significant quantities of what we call outdoor timber and packaging that we produce and sell into our markets. Other includes the appearance grades, furniture timber, material for remanufacturing operations and so forth. Typically, the structural product is taken from the free of heart part of a log, away from the pith and the heart, and hence our grading system tends to be biased in that direction. And you can see here, of the output from a typical sawmill, you'd expect to get 25 to 30% heart affected, which all goes into packaging or landscaping products. It's not well suited to our MGP. 70 to 75% of our production would be from sapwood, or we would say free from heart, and that is predominantly kiln dried and graded for MGP. Pruning of forest is very uncommon in Australia. It used to be popular, say 30 to 40 years ago, but with those sorts of labour costs, you can understand that it's driven us away from pruning and more toward a very different kind of silvicultural regime aimed at the structural production. In a dry mill, you know, we take that 70 or 75% of material that we dry, and we convert that to MGP grades. Typically, we get 85 to 90% going into the MGP grades, and the balance essentially is rejected from structural, and that would go back to remanufacturing, packaging, and that type of market. In Australia, we have quite specific regulatory requirements related to our structural production. Grading we conduct according to a particular standard, AS 1748. It's all about machine grading, or as you see there in the title, mechanically stress grading. That really drives us away from visual grading. Okay, so to participate in MGP, MGP stands for machine graded pine, and effectively that's what it is. We do, though, still have our visual grading system. We have a standard there, 2858, in which we specify the grading rules for F grades, and some of you may be familiar with that from past times. The F grades are fairly easy to apply, and you're all here visually grading in any case. The machine grading comes with some fairly specific obligations on quality control. We're forced under the standard to qualify our grading process to start with, and then to verify every batch of production that we produce. And that is enforced by an auditing organisation that reviews our procedures and our performance continuously. We get a couple of audits a year, probably in the West. We're remote enough that they leave us alone for most of the year, but they are rigorous when they come, and we have to comply. Our consumer law in Australia is interesting too, and this will sort of lead us to further discussion of what we would like to do in future. But we have to be able to show, we as a producer need to be able to back up a claim that a product is of a certain grade. If we claim it's a grade, we have to show that we've used what they might call due diligence to ensure that we've produced compliant product, and also that that product is fit for purpose. And it's the obligation lands on us. We don't have a grading agency or any other entity in between us and the law. So if we have a failure, the onus is on us individually as producers to be able to demonstrate that we're complying. Okay, so we are interested, obviously, in trading with South Africa. We'd like to buy products from South Africa. And to that end, we started the journey, I imagine, 5 odd years ago. And in 2018, we had some visitors from South Africa come and have a look around the industry. Since then, we've had dialogue. The advent, obviously, of COVID has slowed things down a bit, but now that borders are open again and we can travel, we're doing so with the view to developing this trade with our company. In order for us to understand what is on offer in South Africa, it was important for us to obtain samples, to do a whole lot of testing, and to test market the material from South Africa in Australia. We received 180 cubic metres, 4 container loads of material from South Africa. Given that the structural market is the biggest market in Australia, we felt initially that we would look at what the structural properties of the South African material are relative to ours. The samples we got were from 4 South African mills, geographically spread, predominantly S5 and mill run. We sampled that material quite intensively and did structural tests for a range of properties. I'll talk about that in a minute. The balance we planed and graded through our grading system, and we focused on the Australian standard sizes of 90 by 35 and 90 by 45, given that they are the predominant sizes that we use in house construction. And from our perspective, we regard those as benchmark products. They're products that we have an awful lot of data on for the Australian resource, so we could do some really interesting comparisons. We at Westpine have a fairly significant QC laboratory, quality control. We do a lot of our own engineering testing in both tension and bending. You can see there in the photographs, tension tester on the top. That's a full-length tension tester, 6 metre long, and we use that continuously through our own QC systems. We have a bending machine as well on the bottom right, fairly new piece of equipment, and we use that to determine the bending strength and stiffness, and we can use it for other purposes as well. The testing that we did, we used a consultant to oversee. We have fortunately in Western Australia, we have a very well qualified consultancy on our doorstep. These guys have been ISO representatives for Australia on timber grading standards. They're behind our own standards here as well, or in Australia as well. They helped us with the sampling and the analysis of the data. We tested for bending strength and stiffness, for tension, density, moisture, various utility measurements and so forth, and very importantly for us, treatability. A lot of our framing in Australia is treated with a sort of a spray-on envelope treatment for H2 protection for timber frame housing. And we have a significant and rather high-priced market for structural timber treated to H3 specification as well. The upshot of it all, and I won't bore you with endless graphs and tables of figures, but the bottom line is that really the South African fibre and the properties thereof are almost indistinguishable from the Australian fibre. Almost indistinguishable. The key challenge, though, comes in the fact that your grading system here differs significantly from the structural grading system in Australia, and we find that also your silvicultural regimes here promote the growth of high quality appearance grade products more so than ours do. What we found is that the material free from heart from South Africa is excellent for production of MGP grades. So anything away from the pith and heart produced excellent recoveries into MGP. The heart material obviously was of lower stiffness, and the key criterion and the key reason that a lot of the possibly 2/3 of the samples that we tested didn't actually come up to MGP 10 specification is that it was low stiffness, largely because it included quite a percentage of material from close to the heart, if not the pith. The other issue for us, we found in our treatment or treatability testing, was that we can't get sufficient penetration into heartwood. It's exactly the same problem that we face in Australia. If we have heartwood present in material going for H3 treatment, we can't actually meet the specifications. And so the presence of heart was problematic for two reasons: low stiffness and treatability. You can see there a bunch of a pack of timber that's been graded by us. That's indeed South African timber. It looks identical to Australian structural grade. There's really no visible difference. Our sales of South African timber to our customers showed very clearly that they couldn't tell which was South African and which was Australian production. So far as MGP was concerned, very, very marketable product in Australia. West Pine also produces proprietary grades, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but proprietary grades, we've actually, in Western Australia, got a unique position. We're the only significant sawmill in the locality. We'd like to service higher proportion. Toby mentioned 50, 55, 60% market penetration in WA. We'd like to actually get more and more product into high value structural production. So what we've done at our place is to evolve our own grades within the grading system that we have. We can do that, and we have done so. And we've actually got grades which accommodate pith and heart. And that gives us some hope that with a mix of product from South Africa, we could potentially produce quite a range of structural products and still be able to market that comfortably in Australia.
All right. So back to the market. So what I was going to try to do is, on the back of the economics briefing we had before on the situation in South Africa, was I guess give you a cause for optimism that the extent of the challenges we've got in Australia really represent potentially quite a big opportunity for sawmilling and South African sawmilling, in terms of solving what is now becoming quite widely recognised in Australia, that to maintain the form of construction and the rate of construction in Australia, we are just structurally unable to support that market domestically. So I'm going to run through a few charts. I won't bore you with in too much detail, but just to give you a sense for what it looks like over the next 20 or 30 years. We clearly have plenty of land in Australia, but not a lot of land that's suitable for softwood plantations. And one of the challenges is really the competing land use for that land, for other agricultural, high value agricultural uses. And we're not seeing any redevelopment or re-establishment of the resource in any meaningful way. And even if it does start to happen, it's not going to have any impact on supply in the market in the near term. So you can see from that there's a significant implied gap, and really imports are the only solution to that in the near term. The numbers that are quoted there are industry numbers. They're very large. Obviously, they assume that there's no significant change in the way we build. So I guess you could have some substitution into steel framing or other products. But if we keep doing things the way we're doing things, it's very large volumes of imports that need to be sourced to support it. Now, at the moment, Australia imports around 20% broadly. Those numbers you can see there, it's very heavily weighted towards a European product. So the Australian market is, should I say, tolerant of the European product. They would prefer to be taking out domestic resource. But you know, it's a very large proportion of that import volume that's coming from Europe, and it's not a good situation for Australia. It's probably due to geopolitical risk and have a significant concentration from one source. And we think that's, you know, South Africa, having heard what the quality of the resource is like, it's a very similar fibre to what we've got in Australia, but there's also some significant geographic advantages in terms of just access to the market. Now, obviously, we're still talking about very large distances, but I'll share some information later on about what that looks like from days on the water and container costs. But really, I think what we wanted to step into now was just some conclusions that Richard and I are drawing from the last week or so. And I think, you know, we're certainly very optimistic that there's enough of an opportunity in terms of the quality of the product and the Australian market acceptance of that product. So the challenge, and Richard alluded to it before, is that there's going to be some effort required to actually produce a product that is market ready for Australia. So section sizes and even the way that the log is processed. We'll come to that in a second. But we're confident that there's enough of a price spread between the markets, and obviously market prices move. You know, there's a lot of nuance. That's a very simplistic chart shown there. There's obviously significant variation for different producers and different individual products within the market. But we think that the difference is significant enough to be able to absorb the freight cost. And indeed, the freight cost for South Africa is going to be highly competitive relative to anywhere else that Australia sources product from. Indeed, at the moment, and it remains to be seen whether it's going to stay this way or not, but the freight costs out of Europe are probably 5 or 6 times what they might have been not that long ago. We're paying as much as $12,000 a container to be bringing product out, and we'd be expecting out of South Africa, even in current conditions, it's less than half that, and probably less than half the time of the water. So that means a significant working capital benefit of not having large valuable products tied up for long periods of time.
Yeah. Okay, so what we see and have seen from our excuse me, our travels around is that there are there's some low-hanging fruit out there, some relatively low-tech products that we could get started with very quickly and work toward looking at the higher technical specifications over time. And this chart here illustrates that. You know, if you think of technical complexity up the vertical axis, and we're looking at the sorts of products that we could produce in terms of technical complexity increasing to the right along the horizontal axis. There are some treated non-structural type products that fit into our landscaping market that we could get moving on very quickly. There are some visually graded structural products that we could look at as well, and particularly the treated visually graded products at a higher value again. We feel that the proprietary grades and the MGP grades in particular, which require a bit of technical expertise and some investment potentially, we might need to work towards that over time, but that in the short term, we could potentially start that by taking rough sawn material from South Africa to Australia and then processing it into those grades there. Obviously, there's more margin to be gained longer term by processing more here and delivering customer-ready product to Australia over time. If I can just keep chatting here, this photograph here illustrates the typical form of home building in Australia. Okay, so it's very different from South Africa. We don't, generally speaking, use a lot of brick as the structure. We use a timber frame. It's an engineered timber frame. We find that one house consumes something like 14 cubic meters of finished product, and around about half of that is in the wall frame, the rest of it in the roof frame. If you think that in Australia we build about 140,000 houses a year, multiplying 14 by 140, you get close to 2 million cubic meters of wood going into that market alone. So that's why I guess we're particularly interested in the potential of South African timber to make MGP grades, structural grades. In that photograph there, you see the wall framing, the wall studs themselves. They're the vertical members. We call them wall studs. Those comprise pretty close to half the volume of the house. Those we feel they don't necessarily have to be an MGP grade. They can be a different grade. We have our own proprietary grade that we use, and that can accommodate different sorts of material, including some heartwood. Finger jointed studs are often preferred by the builders because they tend to be straighter and more stable. You can imagine one of the challenges in a timber framed house is potentially the movement of the timber over time with changes in moisture content and so forth. Finger jointed studs tend to be a bit more stable and they stay straighter, and so they're preferred. But the proprietary grade that we've developed, you know, as it stands now, doesn't include finger jointing, but we feel comfortable that we could work on that and include that. In this table here, we illustrate that the three most immediate opportunities, I guess. The first one is the sort of rough sawn, generally speaking, run of log type grade, can include some heart. That's generally speaking the landscaping type product that we use. It can be treated, needs to be treated to essentially an H4 specification. CCA is acceptable. A word on treatment in Australia, that there's been a general reaction against the use of CCA. It's a perception in the community that the arsenic is problematic, it's poisonous. We all know that there's not any scientific evidence to show that that represents a significant danger to humans, but in Australia, it's been banned from use for things into which people might come in intimate contact with either hands or feet, decking, playground equipment, handrails, those kinds of things we can't treat in CCA anymore. They have to be treated by some other means, and LOSP, light organic solvent preservatives, has become popular for that. But in terms of H4, you can't use LOSP, it's not up to the mark. And so what we're finding now is that H4 CCA is the predominant product that we sell for landscaping. Sleepers, fence palings and fence posts and rails are also treated in that manner. Sleepers, we're not talking here about a railway sleeper. It's a little bit of a quirk in terminology, I guess. What we're talking of there is something of the order of 200 by 50, or 50 by 200 in your terms, ungraded, CCA treated. And we feel, and all of those products, by the way, are essentially the same kind of timber, same grade, same treatment. Those sorts of products are immediately available to us as a potential for importing from you guys in a customer ready state. If we then think of, well, you know, where else, what other sorts of products could we go for? We could look to the rough sawn product that we could import and reprocess in Australia to our own grades, MGP and so forth. In the short term, it may be possible for you guys to machine to our, or to cut and machine to our specification, our sizes, to grade visually to what we would call an F7 standard. That doesn't relate well to your S7, by the way. It's more like, I think, S5. And we could treat that to an H3 specification. Now, the most popular in Australia for H3, as I mentioned, this LOSP is gaining popularity, but a CCA treated H3 is a possibility. CCA treated F7, H3. The only issue there might be that would need to be re-dried before it goes to a customer in order to be customer ready. The Australian standards require that if we're going to sell a structural grade, it's got to be dry. We can't sell structural grades wet after treatment. And then over time, I think we could sort of scale through, as we mentioned in a previous slide, through to the machine grading and so forth. In addition to those products, of course, there are appearance grade products that are of interest to us. We don't produce them. As I mentioned before, we don't have pruned log. We don't get much select, and certainly not much clear at all. But you guys have that available to you in varying degrees. Interestingly, we don't finger joint very often in Australia. Our structural rules, our MGP, currently doesn't accommodate finger jointed product. Okay, but and in addition to that, I guess finger jointing is a fairly labour intensive product. Our labour costs are very high. In order for us to finger joint economically, we have to have very, very high production. And really, there's no one sawmill in Australia that's got enough wood justify doing that on an ongoing scale, sufficient to justify the kind of capital that we need. But products like decking, flooring, high quality dressed all round product, those things of course sell well, they're high priced, and they sell into a high priced market.
I guess one other comment is really in the course of the last week or so, we're thinking of this as a really an evolution of opportunities. I think we really like to find some products that are market ready that we can do straight away. But as you can see from the market outlook in Australia over the next 10, 20 years, we think even though some of the challenges, which again, I'd like you, Richard, to talk to some of the processing options we've been playing with over the last week or so, we think that they're worth making the effort, that we think there's a significant opportunity, both immediate trading opportunities, but also an opportunity for mills in South Africa to have a toehold in the Australian markets of where allocation of production that makes sense for your business, but we think it's worth making the effort.
Okay, so just to round out from where Toby started there, we've been talking to various of you about the possibility of diverting some of your production, your free from heart material, toward the Australian market for structural products, be they visually graded or ultimately machine graded. And this discussion really relates more to that product than anything else. What we find, and is illustrated on the graph in the chart on the left, or the diagram on the left, is that a lot of South African mills are focusing the outer part of their butt logs essentially toward higher value production. And that, of course, is the product that we're most interested in from an MGP perspective. And it's probably the product that you guys would least like to send us, if you like, because obviously you're generating some quite high value and high margin products from that material. What we're wondering though is whether we can talk about logs higher up the stem. You know, the second log out of a clear fall may offer us quite a lot of opportunity. And we're thinking that, as illustrated there, there might be opportunity for us to still leave you guys with the structural material that works in your market, that closer to the heart, and to cut from sideboards and the outer parts of the cant, the material that might fit the Australian market rather better, or let's say the MGP market. And in some ways, you know, we feel that either just sideboards only, or a more complex cutting pattern, as illustrated on the left, might work for you and work for us. You know, we're not talking about you know, large percentages of your production here. Relatively small percentages could make a very big difference to us.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The intermal comparison was started by my father in 1988, largely as a response to the collapse of the timber marketing agreement, which then exposed the industry to a lot of competition, which it never had before. And a bloodbath ensued. There were 144 formal sawmills at the time, and now we sit with under 40. So that was a hang of an experience that the industry went through. Interestingly, of the 15 original intermal clients, 14 remain to this day. So I think it turned out to be quite a powerful tool. And about 90% of the volume that's traded at the moment is reflected on the intermill comparison. So I'm not the original Crickmay. I went to a sawmill the other day, and the fellow said to me, "Crickmay." He said, "Are you Crickmay, Crickmay?" So I said, "No, I'm not. I'm Crickmay." So after summer, the product really aligned ourselves with Sawmilling South Africa, and Roy, we've really appreciate our relationship. It's always been positive, and we really appreciate yourself, and we appreciate also the data that we've been getting for about 37 years out of everybody, and just to assure you that we take incredible care of the trust that you've placed us with some very, very sensitive information. We have a high standard to adhere to. Many years ago, a guy called Solly Tucker, I don't know if some of you remember him. He was the CEO of York Timbers. And he said, "Crickmay, the only guys that know the color of my underpants and don't tell anyone." So we'll continue to strive to meet Solly's original expectation. What we see here today are a couple of well, a huge amount of work, obviously, from the people that have been working in this industry. And when we come to judge the mills, we judge them on the following criteria. So it's judged over a 5-year period. 50% is of the prize or the judging is given to improve the net margin, 15% to improvement in manpower productivity, 15% in recovery, 10% in improved selling price, and 10% in improvement in total costs. Right, so the runners up in alphabetical order. AC Witcher, followed by Bracken, followed by Mfuluzi, Jesse Vale, Bosi, Lawa, and MTO George. So the winner for this year, sorry, I beg your pardon, RFQ as well, and Thor. Okay, right, the Langadi's song is the winner for this year.